Okay, so our last panel talked about training a highly technical workforce, but of course, workforce requires tools, expertise, data, and I think that's kind of where infrastructure fits in. And especially when you're working on the nanoscale, not to mention across all these scientific disciplines that all have their own unique challenges and unique tool needs. Advanced infrastructure is something that isn't just a need of trainees. It's a need for everyone, whether it's be industry, academics, so on and so forth. So I'm excited to welcome the infrastructure panel to the stage. You guys can start coming on up. This is moderated by NSET member Dave Rampulla from the National Institutes of Health. And it includes Ilke Arslan, who's the director of the Center of Nanoscale Materials at Argonne National Lab. Miguel José Yacamán, who is a Regents Professor of Applied Physics and Materials Science at Northern Arizona University. And we were, if you were checking your agenda closely, we were going to have Lamar Hill from New York Creates, but he could not make it today. But we are very fortunate to have Dr. Ambika Bumb, who's the founder of Bikanta and the Deputy Executive Director at the Bipartisan Commission on Biodefense. She's very familiar with NNI infrastructure. So thank you very much, and take it away, Dave.
Right. Thank you for inviting me to moderate this panel. Yeah, we've heard quite a bit about infrastructure. There won't be a quiz or anything, but I think it's come up in almost every talk and nearly every panel, which I hope stresses the importance and its utility to all of you. So what I'm going to do is when I ask my first question, I'll ask the panel to kind of introduce themselves and give you a little context about who they are and why they're going to answer the question the way they will. So question one. The NNI strategic plan commits to using nanotechnology infrastructure to democratize the nanoscience ecosystem. A lot of this has to do with equitable access, but also broadening the fields and backgrounds of the infrastructure user base. What is an example of nanotechnology infrastructure expanding access and democratizing science from your own experiences? Ilke, you want to start?
Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Ilke Arslan. I'm the director of the Center for Nanoscale Materials at Argonne National Laboratory. The CNM is one of 5 DOE BES user facilities, and we're proud to serve the nanoscience community. And so my background is I'm a physicist, and I was trained as an electron microscopist. So I fit right into the nanocenters. And I'm very passionate about this concept of democratizing science. And in particular, I'm very proud that the DOE user facilities are able to provide this resource for the community. Not only are we now able to provide the equity that perhaps we were missing before in some universities that are R1 might get more money and have better tools, and not so much at R2 or other universities. And with these user facilities, we are basically able to provide that access free of charge to anybody who writes a peer-reviewed user proposal and can come in, and not only is the instrument time free, but also the expertise in teaching them or helping them to acquire the data is free. So I feel very strongly about the equity component, but another way that we are democratizing science, and I'll give you an example from the electron microscopy world. Over 20 years ago, when I was doing my PhD, we had to be experts in how to align the microscope, and aberration correctors were just coming online, and we had to know the intimate details of what all of the aberrations looked like in a ronchogram to be able to align it and get good images. But with the advent of the aberration correctors, we're able to get to sub-angstrom resolution imaging, which is amazing. And I just love taking electron microscopy images and looking at the atomic structure of materials. But now you do not have to train for 3 or 4 years to be an electron microscopist, because you're able to basically push a button and the microscope will align and the aberration corrector will align. And so people who are not experts in electron microscopy and have not trained for that many years can also come and use the tools. And a second example I'd like to give is autonomous discovery or self-driving labs, like the self-driving cars that are a little still frightening to me. The self-driving labs are not as frightening to me, maybe just because I know more about them, but you no longer have to be a benchtop chemist. You don't have to be trained in chemistry in order to come in and be able to run a synthesis protocol, for example. There are robots to be able to do that, and they can synthesize the materials. They can take it over and characterize it into another tool with a mobile robot and then bring it back. And AI and ML helps to drive the entire thing. So you don't have to be there making the decision about which experiment to do next. So we then get to have the time to be creative and think about the best experiments to do, and then let the robot run overnight while we have to sleep and eat and all of those other things. So in summary, I think we're able to provide the resources, and especially now with AI and ML, be able to bring lots of different state-of-the-art characterization techniques to the entire community, and you don't have to be an expert to be able to use them.
Ambika?
Hi, my name is Ambika Bumb. I think, so the question about infrastructure and NI and how it is accessible or an equity and a story example. So I'm going to tell you a bit about my background. I think it'll be evident in my experience how infrastructure has basically shaped my life, infrastructure that came about from NNI. So my parents were, and even I was born in India. My father came from a town where I think he was one of the first people to go to grad school. My mom came from a town where she was one of the first women to go into a STEM career. And when we came here, we ended up settling in South Carolina. The word nanotechnology was not in my vocab until I went to undergrad. And then I went to Georgia Tech. And Georgia Tech at that time, so this is in the early, I started in 2002, right after NNI came into play, and Georgia Tech started to become one of the centers for NNI investments. It became one of the, I think, 14 centers in the NNIN, so National Nanotech Infrastructure Network. And then eventually it went on to, as one of the previous speakers spoke about, I'm going to say all these alphabet soup things because I have in my career been in a lot of different agencies, and every time I have to think about what those letters stand for. But Georgia Tech later on became NNCICO, so the National Nanotech Coordinating Infrastructure Coordinating Office, to really bring together all the different institutes, academic centers, to think about how do you coordinate infrastructure from an academic perspective. But all of those resources all coming into Georgia Tech is where I first learned about what is nanotechnology. I started doing some undergrad research in the nanomedicine field and became inspired and chose then in grad school to go into this field in a PhD program that was very interdisciplinary across 4 different departments and across the pond, so in the UK and at the NIH. And there was infrastructure there that certainly helped me move forward in the work that I was doing. But here on the US side at the NIH, the NIH roadmap, the nanotech roadmap, was being implemented. And the policies that were being put into place, thinking about the big questions, how do you think about regulatory issues in this world? Because this was the earlier days of nanotech becoming its own term. And so how do you address issues with that? How do you think about commercialization, environmental impacts? And so while I was doing my PhD, I was also engaging in some of those policy discussions. I ended up staying at the NIH for 2 postdocs, one in the Cancer Institute, looking at glioblastoma imaging with nanoparticles, but then moved to a biophysics lab in the Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, looking at more single molecule imaging. And from that emerged a technology based on nanodiamonds and defects in them that you can manipulate. Some of their quantum physics properties have been manipulated for, quantum computing and qubit, but not so much for imaging. We turned that into a imageable property for imaging through tissue, and that led to a company. So the company that's up there on the screen was Bikanta. So I then moved to the Bay Area and launched this company. And learned so much, but had to, as a small startup, needed to tap into networks to be able to really accelerate the research that we needed to do. So we learned there about one of the research, the nanoscale research centers, the Molecular Foundry, which was also a user facility that outside folks could apply to come and use. And as a company, having access to that probably reduced our research timescale from being 2.5 year work that would have taken 2.5 years for us to do down to 2 months. We really were able to get key results that we needed to go and raise the next level of investment and then start accelerating towards going to clinical trials. And so having that infrastructure in place, user facilities that even small companies can access, or it's not just small companies. I think the Molecular Foundry last year had more than 1,000 users from 35 states in the US, so 70% of our country was accessing this. So there's a clear need for infrastructure like user facilities. But many people being able to have that one place that you can go to, I think a previous panel was talking about how when you're trying to take academic research out into a company, you need certain kinds of hood space or whatnot. It's easy to find the cell tissue kind of incubator spaces, but finding a nanotech development, characterization, fabs, clean rooms, things like that, in a central place that you can just go and iterate quickly and then move on to the next part of your development is harder. So having infrastructure like that in place definitely helped accelerate Bikanta's growth. So I think with that, you can see how infrastructure became a big key part. Having access to it, no matter from what background you come from what state you're coming from, can really impact the development and careers.
Cool. Yeah, Miguel.
Okay, let me give you a little bit of my background. My name is Miguel. My last name is José Yacamán. In the year 1965, I was a second-year student of physics in the University of Mexico. At that year, you can see the dinosaurs in the street. They were not totally extinguished. And there was a big meeting of the American Physical Society, the Mexican and the Canadian, in Mexico. And I was hired as a projectionist, because remember, those times you have to project the slides. And I was fortunate that Richard Feynman was one of the speakers. He took his slides and talked to me, and I said, Dr. Feynman, there is a group of Mexican students who would like to talk to you. And he said, of course, in the break, let's meet outside the auditorium. So about 10 guys went to meet with him, and he said, what do you want to speak about? And said, physics. I said, no, physics is too boring. I would like to speak about music. And then he started to talk about his experience. The previous year, he has been in Brazil for a sabbatical, and he participated in the School of Samba. During the Carnival of the Brazil, there are a School of Sambas in different neighborhoods who compete. Richard Feynman was part of one of the School of Sambas, and they dance and they display during the Carnival. So, and then he learned to play the bongo there. At least he told us that. In fact, when you see in the film Oppenheimer that Feynman is playing the bongo in Los Alamos, that's not true. At that time, he didn't. But anyway, at the end, he said, look, and then I asked, what do you recommend us to do? And he said, well, you know, there is a talk that I just gave a few years ago, and they printed. There is some good ideas there. Why don't you read it? So here was the title of the talk. Of course, there was no WhatsApp. He couldn't send it by WhatsApp. So after 6 months, I got the paper was called, there is plenty of room at the bottom. And when I read it, I was absolutely fascinated, especially for the part of electron microscopy. Because Richard Feynman said in that paper that as a physicist, you should be more useful and build a better microscope so the biologists can see atoms, okay? And then he started to talk about the resolution of the microscope at that time was 100 angstroms. And he started to discuss some ways to get the resolution down to 1 angstrom. And then to analyze, chemically analyze it. And I've been very fortunately enough that during my career, I started with these old microscopes, and then we ended up with the aberration corrector in which we break the 1 Armstrong barrier, and we can analyze atom by atom chemically. And I should mention that during my PhD thesis, I got my degree in Mexico, but I was sent 2 years to Cambridge, to the Cavendish, to work in electron microscopy. That was the world center of electron microscopy at that time. And my project was to study the initial stage of epitaxy. So with electron microscope. And then, of course, the first stage is nanoparticles. You form nanoparticles. And then I got hooked with nanoparticles. I never went to the next stages of, and ever since I've been working nanoparticles, trying to understand all the beautiful shapes and things like that. And I should say, when I came back to Mexico, I was already an employee on leave. And when I talked to my boss and said, "Well, I work in nanoparticles," he became furious because says, "That is nothing useful. We're really interested in crystals, nanoparticles that have no application." Okay. Anyway, so that's an introduction to how it came out to nanotechnology.
All right. So let's talk about the investment a little bit. So infrastructure investments aren't perceived as particularly flashy, especially when funds go toward maintaining workhorse equipment as taxpayers yourselves. How do you measure and consider the success of state and federally supported infrastructure programs? Okay.
So this is really an interesting question because as being in the user facility, it's very different thinking about, well, I'm also a taxpayer and my dollars are going towards supporting this facility and what are we providing? So some of those statistics that were asked about by, whomever your sponsoring agency is, and ours is the DOE, is what are your number of users and how many publications do you have? Because we're a basic energy sciences facility. I have spent some time thinking about it, like, are there other metrics that we can use that would be better? But I think, as Chad Merkin said this morning, not only is the technique development part of advancing science, which is what we're able to provide, it's also the time that it takes to develop those techniques and so I'm going to pass it over to him.
Okay. So that question, I'm going to break it into two parts. The first part of your was alluding to how talking about infrastructure may not be very sexy. So how do you make it interesting? My current job right now, so after I ran the company, I transitioned into some policy roles because I'd been doing policy work and alongside running the company. And I ended up first at Department of State, right when COVID was breaking and dealing with COVID as it was happening, went to the White House, and I'm now at a bipartisan commission on biodefense. And a big part of my job is getting buy-in from different stakeholders to actually push forth different policy initiatives. And no matter where you are, whether it is with something nanotech, whether it's even just talking to your child about something, I think making something interesting to them is a skill that as scientists as a whole and as nanotechnologists, we have to get better at. And it's not, and the last panel was speaking about this too, about how we do communication in training, but it's not just about being able to explain complicated science. I think the next step of it is understanding, it starts from listening, understanding who you're speaking to, what interests them, and tying your story to theirs. So it's not just communicating complicated science, it is getting them so energized about it that they want to support and push it forward and leave saying, I'm glad someone is like you is working on this particular topic. So getting that buy-in piece of it. So even with infrastructure, what does it come down to then? It's talking about what is the impact of it? How does it impact their day-to-day life? Their life. So whether it's saying that the eyeliner that I'm wearing has carbon nanotechnology inside of it. How is it impacting your health? Whenever it was with COVID, our biggest example of the failure of science was not, we'd had Operation Warp Speed, we had great vaccines and diagnostics that came out, but society didn't buy into using it here in America, whereas in other parts of the world, we saw more buy into it. So what our biggest really lesson here is we have to learn how to excite people about the impact of it. So being able to say the science of the small has world impacts that get to the masses, and being able to translate and get that enthusiasm into it. So even with infrastructure, it's telling that story relevant to that person, that audience, or that group that you're speaking to. Now, the other part of the question was, what was it? It was about.
How do you measure and consider the success of these programs?
Sorry, say that again?
How do you measure and consider the
Success.
success?
Yes. Okay. So again, then the answer to how do you measure success is also depending on who you're speaking to. I think if you're talking to funders, it is you're speaking to maybe publications, jobs created, how many emergency use authorizations came out of that funding, how many maybe how many lives you saved, or how much water you were able to clean. It depends on what it is. Again, I think that depends on the audience that you're speaking to. That's how you determine your measures of success.
So if I can just jump in, what I was going to say is, so when Chad Merkin was talking about the technologies that he started developing back in 2000, he said it took 15 years for that to get into the market. So a lot of the things that we're doing right now at the fundamental science level, we won't see for a very long time. So sometimes it's hard to measure what the success is, because all we can look at right now is like, oh, this is a really great scientific breakthrough, but is it going to lead to something that's going to help people and the communities in the world? That takes more time.
Regarding to infrastructure, I believe strongly that it should be something in the universities. The DOE centers are great. I mean, without those centers, we will be collapsing. However, they are insufficient to the demand that we have, especially in a very competitive world that you have to publish. I mean, you compete with the Chinese. I mean, for everything that I do, there are 6 groups in China doing the same thing. So we need to be fast in the access to the facilities. And sometimes that's a problem. So the universities need to get more facilities. It's not easy. Really, the only way is the NSF MRI. And then, of course, the problem is that the administrators of the universities, when they buy you a printer and the printer goes up toner, they don't want to buy the toner because it's very expensive. So the maintenance of the microscopes is a real pain in the neck. In my case, I was running a large facility in University of Texas, and the suffering on how to pay. And then you ended up charging to the users. And unfortunately, many people cannot pay, okay, or don't have enough funds to pay. So it's really, so we have to find out ways in which we can have support for more equipment from the universities, and also support for maintenance of the university, which I understand is very difficult to see, but that's a point that I would like to say.
Thank you. I think we've got a question from the audience.
We do. We have a few, but I would like to start with one about how the nanotechnology infrastructure can be advanced in order to, or adapted in order to help support innovators to be more effective in translation. So the question is kind of how, given it's often not basic research, how far along the bridge to manufacturing do you think that this kind of infrastructure that we're talking about should play?
So I can just start by saying that at the CNM and the Molecular Foundry and the other DOE user facilities, there are programs at the national labs within which we reside that are sort of startup companies. And as Ambika was saying, that's a lot of the bread and butter. Like those startup companies will work in our facility for about 2 years before they can figure out what they're going to do, and then go off and have the funding to be able to create their own laboratory space. So while we are fundamental science based and we're not going to be scaling things up at these facilities, definitely we are the starting point for many startup companies.
So from my experience of running a startup, When you are in startup mode, you're very focused on being nimble and iterating quickly. It is less about producing publications. It's almost rarely about publications. It's far more about iterating the technology to be the most impactful, so then you can raise the next investment round to start heading to market. So being able to iterate quickly means you want all of your team to be just doing the research side, not doing the sort of maintenance of equipment. Like you want to be able to access a TEM without having to deal with learning how to maintain it or upkeep or getting the ink for a printer. The maintenance and even the investment of being able to do that research, sometimes you may only need to take 5 images in a period of 5 months. Why would you raise $100 million to buy the equipment that you need? So having infrastructure that may be in national lab structure, it may be at a university, also from the private sector, creating accelerator type facilities that allow access to joint equipment, where sometimes the people who are running that equipment are also experts on developing that technique. So you can get more information out of that technique, that characterization, or that fab facility that you wouldn't. So they're almost like I often thought of a lot of the people at the Molecular Foundry as extended team of Bikanta, because I mean, they weren't on my payroll, but they were definitely contributing to the science of what we were doing. And so infrastructure definitely plays an important role, not so much on thinking of how to scale or how to get to market, but being a central hub to be able to iterate quickly and also gain knowledge from others who are coming in and out of there, sometimes other startups, sometimes other scientific disciplines. And so when you need to be nimble and fast, that's where these kinds of central locations can really help accelerate innovation.
I think this is a very important problem. I would like to mention the case of Arizona now. As you know, in Arizona, there are being built 2 huge microchip factories. And of course, a lot of companies are moving to Arizona, the ones that provide to those huge Taiwan Semiconductors and Intel. And then there is a big need of those companies to really interact with the universities. And because sometimes they don't have the facilities, and also the training of people, which is very important. It's something they don't do. So there are good experiences now. In a couple of weeks, we are going to a meeting here in Washington with one semiconductor company of Arizona to submit a joint project between the Northern Arizona University and the company to the CHIPS Act, okay? Which if it happens, that would be really great, because then they will have that. And let me just mention one thing. A few years ago, 2 years ago, the CEO of Intel said that the 5 factories that are being built in this country, they will need in the next 5 years, because now are being built, they are still not operating. They are going to need 50,000 highly trained engineers, at possibly at the master or PhD. I wonder where are we going to get those engineers? Okay, but we have to think in a plan. And I think, in my opinion, one of the pathways is to look at the community colleges, because there is a lot of talent there that we can, recruit, probably shorten the time a little bit to some specialized training, but otherwise this country is not going to be able to really go the and finally, I would like to say something. The companies now, they have what they call 3 nanometer chip, which is not really 3 nanometers. It's like 40 and 20. Now the next generation is 2 nanometers. They probably in 2 years, they will be in the market. And there are, to the so-called 1 nanometer chip, which is going to be 10 angstroms and 15 angstroms. Now, at that point, you are talking about quantum mechanics. You are talking about a completely different game, and you will need people trained. And that's a tremendously competitive. And I should say I'm impressed by the development effort from the companies. Sometimes they don't tell you what they're doing, but you can guess it. But I wish the universities will be in the same pace.
If I can add something else too. So I was talking a bit about when you're doing the tech development, but especially if you're in the sort of biotechnology, healthcare translation space, there are other great infrastructure things that can help you in understanding how to effectively get through the FDA process, for instance, what kind of studies you need to run. So for instance, the NIH has, through the National Cancer Institute, the Nano Characterization Lab, which was set up in partnership maybe with FDA and NIST. So along with having a bunch of characterization tools, they had expertise there on how do you think about your application process for FDA approval, what kinds of pharmacokinetic studies you might need, what kind of cytotoxicity data would you want to gather. So preparing you as from the innovation perspective, from the company perspective, how to prepare for the applications that you'll have to pass as well. So having central infrastructure like that also is a teaching mechanism and a educational mechanism for those who are trying to commercialize nanotech.
So I think Miguel actually touched on competitiveness a couple times in his remarks. And so let's talk about competitiveness for a little bit. How does the NNI support American competitiveness through its infrastructure investments? Okay.
You want some?
We're going in order.
We'll keep,
Um,
you're welcome to switch it up if you like.
So definitely, I think it is, like I said, it's an equalizer. So people who are at universities who don't have access to the facilities now can. So we can train the next generation of workforce to have equity as they move on to the next, positions and jobs that they would like to try to get. So I think that I don't know why I keep losing my train of thought. It's like the screen up here that's writing down everything that I'm saying is throwing me off. I have to stop looking over there. Okay, so it's really bad. So I think that we are definitely competitive in that way. However, as Miguel was saying, if you look at what the investment that China is putting into their facilities, it's so much more than what we're doing. So I think that if we're going to stay competitive in the US, we need to put a lot more funding into our infrastructure.
You want to break the pattern and go next?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think, of course, we need to invest more in infrastructure, and also we have to be innovative in infrastructure. And let me tell you two examples which are happening, both of them supported by the NSF in Arizona. One of them is the compact free electron laser. And free electron laser for biology and for materials is going to be extremely important, extremely important. And in ASU, they're building something they call a tabletop, which is not really tabletop, but that will open the way to really have more of these facilities. And the second one, they are building a high pressure facility. Because one of the frontiers, in my opinion, of nanotechnology is producing materials at high pressure. Remember, as you push carbon, you get diamond, okay? So if you take an alloy and then you squeeze it, something is going to happen, a new material is going to produce with new facilities, okay? And I think it's very exciting. It's going to be building with NSF support. And finally, one goal that we should do is to, now the material science people are very happy because we can see atoms. Biology people still are not at that level. Of course, cryo microscopy, as Cheryl said, is fantastic, is a fantastic tool. But I guess we should go to the next step and go to look atoms in biological material. That we can do it physically if we combine ultrafast detection, because there are two problems, radiation damage and lack of contrast. We can solve these problems eventually, and then one of the goals should be to develop one of these projects for the future, because looking at atoms at the biological level, that will be a really breakthrough. And there's nothing in physics to say that it's not can be. Okay.
So this question about competitiveness is a challenging one across all sort of disciplines of science and technology, because we're not going to be able to outpace China in terms of numbers of people working on a topic or the amount of investment they're throwing at certain areas. But can we be smart about how we think about competitiveness is sort of a different question. I remember whenever I was in my undergrad years and sitting on the Georgia Tech Advisory Board, which brought in a bunch of industry folks, they spent a lot of time at that time talking about competitiveness with India, and how IT sector was picking up very quickly, and how do we make sure our engineers, because Georgia Tech is the engine, you come out as a hell of an engineer. How do you make them, competitive at being able to lead whenever there's so much manpower in other parts of the world as well? And it was very much a conversation focused at that time on leadership skills of how do you coordinate, being able to coordinate different teams in different parts of the world. I think today it's less about coordinating, but I think the lessons that we've learned in the last 5-6 years has been about how do we drive impact from whatever the investment is. So it's almost flipping it from competitiveness to just focusing on impact. So how quickly does it turn into a market that people buy into or use or utilize in whatever way, whether we're talking about, I don't know, diagnostics, or we're talking about energy or food security or different ways of using nanotechnology. Now we're ahead of the game compared to other countries because of the NNI. We started earlier. We have all this infrastructure that's in place, but I don't know that we need to reinvent new infrastructure. It's how do we optimize the use of what we have? How can we think about grand challenges? Now we're not so much at the phase of what is technology, nanotechnology, and what can we come from it? We have an idea of what can come from it, but how do we impact it to grand challenges? How do we think about climate change impacts? Or how do we think about pandemic preparedness, which is the place that I spend a lot of time thinking about. Or how do you apply the technology to a variety of different problems that need solutions? And so rather than focusing so much on competitiveness, if you're just being effective at the impact and the solution, that will drive the competitiveness.
Maybe got time for one more question here. Actually, I think, we've been touching a little bit on emerging technologies, right? We hear a little bit about vaccines and biotechnology and microelectronics and quantum technologies. And so how have you seen the nanoscale infrastructure enabling nanoscientists to more quickly respond to new challenges? And how do you see our current nanotech infrastructure supporting the emerging technology ecosystem? Okay.
Okay. I think COVID is certainly one of the strongest examples, but perhaps Miguel will talk about that. I can say for QAS that the nanocenters have been really critical in being able to take the techniques that we have and be able to apply it to QAS, because as I like to say, everything is nanoscale, everything is nanomaterials. It's all about, if you want to understand how anything works, you have to understand how it works at the atomic, at the molecular level first. So with QAS, I mean, we're looking at single atoms and and then how those entangle and talk to each other. So we were able to pivot very quickly to start looking at some QAS challenges. And now with the 5 quantum centers that are set up across the United States, there's one that's in the Chicago area at Argonne as well. And so we have a lot of collaborations with them. And a lot of those scientists come over and use our tools, but we've also developed other new tools to be able to look at specific surfaces and qubits and dilution refrigerators to look at things cold and to try to look at things in ultra high vacuum, like scanning tunneling microscopes. So we have a great partnership with QNext, which is our quantum center. And I think that has been a really strong investment.
Well, one thing I would like to say is that, of course, the nanotechnology infrastructure has to be keep moving. Like William Blake used to say, still water gets poison. Okay, so we need to keep moving and improving. And one of the ways to do it is with more cooperation, a little bit more cooperation. I would like to mention that the European community, they have focus groups. They support a group of 20 researchers, and they get money to travel and to meet 4 or 5 times a year. And then they have been proven that they take the lead of the field very, very easily. Like, for instance, I give you an example of the network of nanoalloys, very specific topic. Now, these guys now are the #1 because they're cooperating. And I think we should promote this in this country. Making cooperation internal because, we always learn from other colleagues, and also we can discuss topics in which we can be stronger. That will be one of the things that will be very important. And we need to renew the infrastructure all the time because 10 years is the lifetime of an instrument. So we have to keep renewing.
So the question was, how have we seen a grant infrastructure related to NNI help to deal with a rising challenge, I think. So I will speak about the example you told me to talk about, COVID. We have academia, we have industry, and we have government. And the more that they engage effectively, the more we can iterate quickly to respond to a challenge. So I think with COVID, when Operation Warp Speed was happening, but also let's say we focus on ACTIVE or RADx, which were programs that were related to vaccine development and diagnostics. Because the infrastructure, now this is a different kind of infrastructure, but infrastructure was in place in terms of a network of industry and academia through the POC term. So point of care technology research network, I think, if I'm remembering all the
Yeah, you
letters.
got it.
Got it? Okay. When Congress approved the supplemental funding, I think within 5 days, RADx was up and running and actually out there getting submissions from companies, from academia, from whoever was working on different types of diagnostics that could then that used a lot of nanotech to be able to, to get the diagnostics for COVID. And I'm not going to be able to recall the numbers, but I want to say 44, I think, diagnostic platforms were then approved for emergency use authorization pretty quickly out of that. So we were able to very quickly respond to the diagnostic piece of it, but where we failed then was people using the diagnostics as much as we needed them to. So we have to, it's technology, we are really good now with nanotechnology of having a lot of network in place, infrastructure in place, but utilizing it effectively with industry, academia, government together, but also informing the public and engaging the public and communicating it is where the next sort of big effort needs to go. So that when we do these technologies and we're trying to have impact, it's actually effective.
All right. Thank you. I think we have absorbed all plus a little more. Yeah, this was a great panel. Thank you for your perspectives. I think it's really fun to hear the workforce panel and the infrastructure panel back to back. It's kind of the lifeblood of the nanotechnology enterprise. And so, yeah, no, thank you for your attention. Thanks.
Thank you.